I wanted to be a genius. I wanted the superpower of never forgetting a single face, a single name, or a single mistake. But be careful what you wish for, because when you turn your brain into a perfect machine, the world stops being a story and starts being a flood. To understand the weight of this power, we have to look at the day it was born, in blood. 2,500 years ago, a poet named Simonides walked out of a victory banquet seconds before the roof collapsed, turning a celebration into a graveyard. The bodies were unrecognizable, but then something supernatural happened. Simonides closed his eyes and saw the room, not as a memory, but as a living map. He identified every victim by where they sat. He had discovered the art of memory, but he also discovered the horror of a mind that can never go quiet. It is the most dangerous skill you will ever learn. But to understand how a normal person can do this, we first have to ask, where do you even find the smartest human on Earth? We usually assume genius is genetic, a hardware upgrade you're either born with or you aren't. We look for the prodigies, the human calculators, the people whose brains operate on a frequency the rest of us can't even hear. When journalist Joshua Foer started his journey, he thought he'd find a secret society of mutants, but what he discovered was far stranger. The people performing impossible mental feats, memorizing entire books or thousands of numbers in minutes, were completely average. They weren't born with supercomputers in their skulls. They simply possessed the map that Simonides drew 2,500 years ago. But to understand how a normal brain can be hacked, scientists first had to study a brain that was naturally broken, a brain that couldn't stop remembering. In the 1920s, a Russian reporter known in medical journals simply as S walked into a psychology lab. He didn't take notes during his meetings. He didn't need to. He could perfectly recall a speech word for word, forwards or backwards, decades after he heard it. But to him, it wasn't a parlor trick. It was a neurological storm. S had a severe form of synesthesia. For him, every sound had a physical weight. Every word had a distinct taste. A sharp tone of voice could literally feel like a cold, rough sponge scraping against his skin. We think we want a perfect memory, but imagine if every single time you heard the word rain, your brain violently forced you to relive the smell of wet asphalt, the exact pitch of thunder from a storm 12 years ago, and the freezing sensation of water on your neck. You wouldn't be able to think. You would be paralyzed. Because he remembered every single agonizing detail, S couldn't understand the big picture. He couldn't grasp simple poetry or metaphors because the literal images of the words clouded his mind. If a friend smiled one day and frowned the next, S couldn't recognize them. The data was too different. He was drowning in an ocean of perfect, useless details. He spent his final years desperate to learn how to forget. He would write his memories on pieces of paper and literally burn them just to find a single moment of silence. The tragic life of S proved a terrifying truth. Forgetting isn't a glitch in our hardware. It is a vital survival mechanism. It's how our brains filter out the noise so we can actually understand the world. So, if a naturally perfect memory is a curse, how do the mental athletes of today perform their miracles? How do they memorize thousands of numbers without losing their minds? They aren't cursed like S. They've just figured out how to turn the machine on and off. If S was a man drowning in an ocean of memory, the people competing at the World Memory Championship are deep-sea divers. When journalist Joshua Foer first attended these championships, he expected to find a room full of savants. He expected human calculators, freaks of nature. Instead, he found a bunch of guys who looked like they should be arguing about sports at a local bar. These were the experts of experts, men and women who could memorize the exact order of a shuffled deck of cards in under 30 seconds, or commit thousands of binary digits to memory in minutes. But when Foer asked them about their gift, they all told him the exact same terrifying truth. They didn't have photographic memories. In fact, most of them claimed they had average or even poor natural memories. They couldn't remember where they put their car keys, but they could memorize a phone book. Why? Because they didn't rely on their biological hardware. They had built a software overlay. They had taken the chaotic, overwhelming flood of human experience and forced it into an ancient architectural grid. They didn't just remember things, they placed them in a constructed reality. But to understand why building this architecture is so vital to our survival, we have to look at the exact opposite of these champions. We have to meet the most forgettable human in the world. In 1992, a retired laboratory technician named Eugene Pauly, known to science simply as EP, woke up with a mild fever. A virus had slipped past his blood-brain barrier and systematically destroyed his hippocampus. The internal hard drive of his mind was completely hollowed out. When the fever finally broke, EP was physically fine, but mentally, he was trapped in a permanent, inescapable now. If you walked into his living room, introduced yourself, and stepped out into the hallway, by the time the door clicked shut, you were erased from his universe. He would welcome you back seconds later as a total stranger. He couldn't remember what he had for breakfast. He didn't know if he had grandchildren. He was a man with no past, and therefore, no future. Psychologists studied EP for years. He was always polite, always friendly, and always completely lost. The tragedy of EP reveals the most terrifying truth about human nature. We tend to think of our memories as just a filing cabinet of trivia, a storage unit for passwords and addresses. But memory is the absolute glue of your identity. You are nothing more than the sum of the stories you can remember about yourself. Without them, you aren't just forgetful. You cease to exist as a person. You become a ghost, haunting your own body, which brings us back to the champions. If losing your memory means losing your soul, what happens when you decide to build an indestructible fortress to protect it? Welcome to the Palace of Memory. To protect themselves from the void, the ancient Greeks invented a cognitive fortress. Evolution didn't design our brains to remember phone numbers, binary code, or grocery lists. Abstract data is completely invisible to our biology, but our brains are flawlessly engineered for two very specific things: spatial awareness and the bizarre. If you want to remember something, you don't just repeat it until your throat is dry. You have to hack your own evolutionary biology. You have to build a memory palace. Think of your childhood home. You know every hallway, every creaking floorboard, every shadow. That architecture is permanently burned into your hippocampus. Now, take the boring data you want to remember and turn it into a vivid, grotesque, or impossible image. Then, physically place it inside that house. Need to remember to buy salmon and milk? Don't write it down. Imagine a giant, rotting salmon thrashing violently on your childhood bed, bleeding gallons of milk onto the floor. It's disgusting. It's absurd. And that is exactly why your brain will never ever forget it. You aren't memorizing anymore. You are walking through a haunted house of your own creation, simply looking at the monsters you left behind. You have just anchored a fragile thought to a physical space. But what happens when you need to memorize something infinitely more complex than a grocery list? How do you trap the abstract soul of a poem? You have your palace. The walls are built. But how do you furnish it with something as abstract as language? If you want to memorize a poem, reciting it over and over is the worst thing you can do. The brain despises repetition. It actively deletes the mundane to save energy. To lock words into your mind, you have to turn poetry into a theater of the absurd. Take Shakespeare, to be or not to be. If you just read it, the words vanish like smoke. But what if you place a giant, weeping honeybee holding a human skull, balancing on the edge of a burning number 2, right in the middle of your living room? You aren't remembering the words anymore. You are simply walking through your palace, decoding a nightmare you specifically designed to trap the information. But just as we rediscover this ancient, indestructible architecture, a modern tragedy is unfolding. We are abandoning our palaces entirely and willingly handing our memories over to the machines. And this leads to the end of remembering. For thousands of years, humans carried their entire lives inside their heads. Every phone number, every map of the city, every story of their ancestors. But today, a mass eviction is happening. We are the first generation in the history of humanity to willingly abandon our palaces. We have outsourced our minds to external hard drives. Google, GPS. The glowing rectangles in our pockets hold perfect, infinite memories, while our actual brains are left starving. We don't need to remember the way home. We don't need to remember the voices of our friends. The machine does it for us. But here is the terrifying truth about outsourcing your mind. Memory isn't just a filing cabinet. It is the raw material of human creativity. Creativity is just the ability to connect the dots. But you cannot connect the dots if you don't have any dots stored inside your own head. When we stop remembering, we stop thinking deeply. We become shallow processors of an infinite scrolling void. If you want to take your mind back, you have to rebuild the palace. But the moment you start, you will hit an invisible wall. You will encounter the hill of satisfaction. When you finally decide to rebuild your palace, you will experience a terrifying surge of ability. You will memorize a deck of cards in 10 minutes. You will feel unstoppable. And then you will hit a wall. A massive, invisible barrier that psychologists call the OK Plateau, or the Hill of Satisfaction. We all hit it. Whether you are learning to type, play guitar, or build a perfect memory, you get just good enough to survive and your brain switches to autopilot. But autopilot is the enemy of genius. The moment a skill becomes comfortable, your brain stops building new architecture. You are permanently stuck on the hill. To climb higher, you have to do something your biology violently hates. You have to force yourself into failure. You have to speed up until your mind crashes. You have to practice in the dark. You have to deliberately break the machine just to see how it repairs itself. Because the only difference between an amateur rotting on the hill and the 10 most talented people on Earth is how much pain they are willing to endure in the valley. We have a deeply comforting myth in our society, the myth of the natural. We look at the top 10% of any field, the grandmasters, the prodigies, the memory champions, and we tell ourselves a lie. We say they were just born with it, because if they were born with it, it excuses us from the pain of trying. But when scientists actually study the elite, the truly 10 talented individuals, they find almost zero evidence of innate biological superiority. The only difference between you and the person standing on the podium is a map. The elite didn't rely on talent. They relied on a brutal, systematic dismantling of their own weaknesses. While the amateur blindly practices what they are already good at, enjoying the comfort of the hill, the expert spends thousands of hours in the dark, failing on purpose. They map the exact dimensions of their own ignorance. Because greatness isn't a gift from the gods. It is a terrifyingly mechanical process. And inside every single one of us, there is a relentless calculating machine waiting to be turned on. We just have to wake up the Rain Man inside. Deep inside your subconscious, there is an entity that never sleeps. It is a highly mechanized, brutally efficient part of your brain that records absolutely everything. Every license plate you walk past, the exact number of stairs in your house, the precise frequency of a stranger's voice. It misses nothing. But your conscious mind, the part of you listening to me right now, builds a massive wall to block it out. Because if you felt the full weight of that processing power, you would shatter. But when you start practicing the art of memory, when you build the palace, you intentionally tear a hole in that wall. You wake the machine up. The world stops being a blur and snaps into a terrifying, high-definition reality. You realize your brain is a supercomputer that you've been using as a pocket calculator. And when Joshua Foer finally woke his machine, he didn't just finish his research. He walked onto the stage of the United States Memory Championship. Exactly 1 year after he started his research as a skeptical journalist, Joshua Foer stood on the stage of the United States Memory Championship. He wasn't there to write a story anymore. He was sitting at a dark table, wearing heavy, industrial earmuffs and completely blacked out goggles with only tiny pinholes drilled through the center. The room was dead silent. A judge placed a shuffled deck of 52 playing cards on the table. The timer started. Foer didn't see paper and ink. He saw his childhood home. He saw a moonwalking Albert Einstein. He saw monsters, knights, and bizarre machinery. He was violently sprinting through the dark hallways of his own mind, dropping grotesque, unforgettable images into every corner. 1 minute and 40 seconds later, he stopped. He had memorized the entire deck. He didn't win the championship because he was a mutant or a genius. He won because he had built the biggest, most terrifying palace in the room. In the end, Moonwalking with Einstein isn't really a story about parlor tricks. It isn't about memorizing a deck of cards or impressing people at a party. It's a warning and a challenge. We are living in an era where we are willingly letting our internal worlds crumble into dust. Every time you outsource a memory to a glowing screen, you lose a brick of your own identity. You let the tragic void of the forgetful man creep a little closer. But the palace of memory proves that your mind is not a fragile, fixed thing. It is an ancient, infinite architecture waiting to be built. You have the exact same hardware as the smartest humans on Earth. You just have to be willing to wake the machine up. You have to be willing to look at the monsters you place in the dark. Your life is exactly the sum of what you can remember. Build a palace worth living in. And if you want to uncover another terrifying truth about life and reality, click the video on the screen right now. I'll see you there. Welcome to ZnewWorld.